Hello everyone. Welcome to Sleepy Crimes Hub. I'm here with you tonight to help you relax and slowly fall asleep. I know many of you are watching this video to rest your mind. So before we begin, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Now get comfortable, close your eyes if you like, take a deep breath, and let go of the day. Let's gently begin with case 1. On January 31st, 2020, in the heart of Kabul, Afghanistan, an experienced American engineer walked out into a city he had visited many times before and vanished without a trace. What began as a routine business trip soon turned into one of the most mysterious and politically sensitive hostage cases of the decade. For nearly 3 years, silence, negotiations, denials, and desperate pleas would surround the name Mark Randall Frericks, a man who disappeared into the shadows of war, diplomacy, and international power games. Mark Randall Frericks was born on July 13, 1962. He was not a soldier on the battlefield, nor a diplomat negotiating treaties. He was a civil engineer and director of International Logistical Support, a company involved in infrastructure projects. Before his engineering career, he had served as a diver in the United States Navy, a role that required discipline, courage, and calmness under pressure. Since 2012, his work had taken him to Afghanistan multiple times. He understood the risks. He knew the environment, but nothing could have prepared him or his family for what would happen in early 2020. By January 2020, Afghanistan was a fragile landscape of ongoing conflict and delicate negotiations between the United States and the Taliban. Despite tensions, Frericks continued his professional commitments. There were no public warnings, no dramatic signs of danger around him in the days leading up to his disappearance. Yet beneath the surface, the political atmosphere in the country was tense. Armed groups operated in the shadows, and kidnappings had become a powerful bargaining tool in international conflicts. On January 31st, 2020, Frericks disappeared in Kabul. There was no public struggle, no widely reported witnesses, just a sudden absence. Within a week, U.S. intelligence officials tracked his cell phone signal to a village near where he had vanished. A raid was conducted. Individuals were detained and questioned, but the operation produced no breakthrough. The trail went cold almost immediately, deepening the mystery and raising fears that this was no ordinary kidnapping. In February 2020, confirmation came through intelligence sources. Mark Frericks had been captured by the Haqqani Network, a powerful militant group closely aligned with the Taliban. Publicly, Taliban spokesmen denied holding him, stating they had conducted internal inquiries and found no involvement. But intelligence assessments pointed in a different direction. Meanwhile, in early February 2020, the United States signed a peace deal with the Taliban, and Frericks' name was not included in its terms. For his family, this omission felt devastating. Back home, his sister, Charlene Kakora, became one of his strongest voices. She publicly questioned why her brother was not part of negotiations that were reshaping the future of Afghanistan. The FBI, leading efforts through the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell, pledged that they were working to bring him home. On May 10, 2020, the FBI announced a $1 million reward for information leading to his release or rescue. Simultaneously, the U.S. State Department's Rewards for Justice program offered $5 million for information about his location. The financial incentives were massive, but answers remained scarce. Months passed. On November 21, 2020, the New York Times reported that Frericks was still being held captive, even as U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo traveled to Afghanistan to participate in peace negotiations. It remained unclear whether Frericks' captivity was directly addressed in those discussions. As global politics shifted and U.S. military withdrawal plans accelerated, his case risked fading into the background of larger geopolitical events. Then, on April 1, 2022, more than 2 years after his disappearance, a video surfaced. In it, Mark Frericks appeared alive, pleading for help. The footage confirmed what his family had both feared and hoped. He was still alive. The emotional impact was overwhelming. His family joined the Bring Our Families Home campaign, advocating publicly for Americans detained abroad. Despite diplomatic efforts and renewed inquiries following the release of another American captive earlier in 2022, progress toward Frerich's freedom remained painfully slow. Finally, on September 19, 2022, nearly 3 years after he disappeared, a dramatic development unfolded at Kabul's airport. The Taliban-led government of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan confirmed a prisoner exchange with a U.S. delegation. Mark Frerichs was released in exchange for Bashir Noorzai, an Afghan figure previously imprisoned in the United States. The deal marked the end of a long and uncertain captivity, but it also highlighted the complex political negotiations behind hostage diplomacy. For Frerich's family, the relief was immeasurable. Years of uncertainty, fear, public advocacy, and emotional exhaustion finally ended with his return. His case stands as a stark reminder of how civilians can become entangled in global conflicts far beyond their control, and how families must often fight tirelessly to keep their loved ones from being forgotten. If this story moved you, remember that many families around the world are still waiting for answers. Cases like Mark Frerich's show how fragile safety can be in conflict zones and how powerful public awareness can become. Subscribe for more detailed true crime and real-world hostage stories, and let me know in the comments. Do you think prisoner exchanges like this are necessary diplomacy, or do they create dangerous precedents? Case 2 in March 2020, as the world was just beginning to shut down under the terrifying uncertainty of a global pandemic. A quiet neighborhood in Jupiter, Florida became the setting of a crime so chilling it would shock the entire community. What first appeared to be a COVID-related quarantine quickly unraveled into a calculated act of violence, deception, and desperation. Behind closed doors, in the early morning darkness of March 21st, 2020, Gretchen Anthony's life was brutally taken, and the man responsible would attempt to hide behind fear, lies, and a collapsing world. Gretchen Stoughton Anthony was born on January 8, 1969, in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. Raised in New Jersey in the communities of West Long Branch and Wanamassa, she graduated from Shore Regional High School in 1987 before continuing her education at Witobe Coburn School and later earning her bachelor's degree from Monmouth University. For many years, she dedicated her life to education, including working at the Weiss School. By 2020, at 51 years old, Gretchen had built a stable life in Jupiter, Florida, where she worked as a human resources manager for a utility company. She was a devoted mother to her 12-year-old daughter from a previous relationship, and those who knew her described her as responsible, caring, and deeply committed to her family. David Ethan Anthony, born David Anthony Deutsch, was a fitness trainer who met Gretchen at a gym where he worked as her trainer. Their relationship moved quickly, and in March 2015, they were married in a chapel in Las Vegas. But beneath the surface, David's past and behavior painted a troubling picture. Years earlier, he had served a brief jail sentence after robbing a Blockbuster store using a squirt gun. His employment history was unstable. He had been fired in 2017, briefly rehired in 2020, and then terminated again. His manager even warned Gretchen to stay away from him, describing him as unstable, a warning Gretchen reportedly acknowledged by saying that David was crazy. Despite this, the marriage continued until cracks became impossible to ignore. By late 2019, the relationship had deteriorated. The couple separated, and in November 2019, David moved in with his mother. On February 28, 2020, Gretchen officially filed for divorce. She installed security cameras after David returned to her home uninvited, signaling that she feared what he might do. Around the same time, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a global pandemic. While many people were anxious, David took his fear to an extreme level. He believed the virus was an end-of-the-world prophecy and tried to convince Gretchen to flee with him to Costa Rica, claiming it was their only chance to survive. She refused. Just days before the murder, David's behavior escalated further. On March 15, 2020, he was reported for following teenage girls at a mall. When confronted by law enforcement, He resisted arrest and slammed a car door on an officer's arm, leading to charges of resisting arrest with violence. He spent several days in jail before posting $3,000 bail. He was released only 3 days before Gretchen's murder and was ordered not to leave the county. The warning signs were glaring, but no one could have predicted how quickly events would spiral. In the early hours of March 21st, 2020, dressed in dark clothing, David entered Gretchen's home in the Abacoa community of Jupiter. Surveillance footage later showed him lurking on her patio before going inside. The cameras captured muffled audio of Gretchen desperately trying to call 911 through Amazon Alexa. A neighbor would later recall hearing a woman scream, "No, no, it hurts." The footage also revealed David loading items into Gretchen's car, a water jug smeared with blood, and him reaching up to disable one of the security cameras. Inside the home, a violent struggle had taken place. When Gretchen failed to meet a friend for lunch on March 21st and did not show up for work on March 23rd, her family grew concerned. Soon after, they began receiving text messages from her phone claiming she was quarantining due to COVID-19. Her co-workers received an email on March 24th repeating the same explanation. But something felt wrong. Her vehicle was later discovered in the parking lot of Jupiter Medical Center, containing her purse. Hospital officials confirmed she had not been a patient there since 2008. Blood was found on the steering wheel and gear shift. Inside her home, investigators discovered shattered glass on her bed, a broken picture frame, a stained towel, bleach stains in the garage, and cleaning products placed suspiciously around the house. When questioned, David told authorities that Gretchen had COVID-19 and was being treated at a Centers for Disease Control facility in Belglade, a facility that did not exist. Meanwhile, his mother revealed that he had packed up his truck and left for Costa Rica with his dog on March 24th. During his journey, he stopped at jewelry stores attempting to sell Gretchen's jewelry, telling one owner it belonged to someone who had died from COVID-19. Cell phone data traced Gretchen's phone to Pensacola, Florida on March 25th and later to Texas. David's phone pinged in Pecos, Texas on March 27th and Las Cruces, New Mexico the next day. The digital trail was closing in. On March 31st, 2020, David Anthony was arrested in Las Cruces, New Mexico, while walking his husky near a gas station. He was charged with second-degree murder and kidnapping and held without bail. Authorities believed he had been attempting to flee to South America. After being extradited to Jupiter on May 14th, he initially insisted Gretchen was alive, claiming she had uncovered illegal activity at her company and was on the run. But as evidence mounted, his story collapsed. As part of a plea agreement, David admitted that he stabbed Gretchen to death in her garage on March 21st, 2020, and disposed of her body. On December 21st, 2020, her remains were discovered just 3 miles from her home, in a grassy area behind a Walmart and near a retirement community. She had suffered multiple stab wounds to her neck and torso. The truth was finally confirmed, but the pain for her family was permanent. During sentencing, David claimed that the COVID-19 pandemic had psychologically pushed him toward the crime, describing it as an Armageddon scenario in his mind. Family members stated he had long struggled with bipolar disorder. However, the court focused on the brutality of his actions and the deliberate attempts to mislead investigators. On January 14, 2021, he was sentenced to 38 years in prison and is expected to remain incarcerated until 2058, when he would be 81 years old. Gretchen's murder is a haunting reminder that sometimes the greatest danger does not come from global crises, but from the people closest to us. As the world feared a virus, one family faced a far more personal nightmare: betrayal, violence, and irreversible loss. If this case moved you, share your thoughts below and subscribe for more detailed true crime stories that uncover not just what happened, but why. Case 3 in the vast, silent desert outside Joshua Tree, where the wind moves across open land without witnesses and the heat swallows footprints within minutes. A young woman walked away one summer afternoon in June 2021 and was never seen alive again. What began as a spontaneous road trip fueled by freedom, music, and new beginnings slowly turned into a haunting mystery buried in the rugged terrain of Yucca Valley. Her name was Lauren L. Cho, and her disappearance would spark questions not only about what happened in those final hours, but also about why some missing persons cases capture the world's attention while others fade into silence. Lauren Cho, affectionately known as Elle, grew up in Hunterdon County, New Jersey. She graduated from Hunterdon Central Regional High School in 2009 and went on to study music education at Westminster Choir College. Those who knew her describe her as creative, passionate, and deeply connected to music. She later became a high school music teacher, dedicating herself to inspiring young students. But by the winter of 2020, something in her life had shifted. She left her teaching job, searching for something different, perhaps freedom, perhaps reinvention, perhaps simply distance from routine. In the spring of 2021, she met Cody Orell around Memorial Day. Soon after, she joined him on a cross-country road trip. The plan was adventurous and unconventional. They would travel west and eventually settle in Bombay Beach, California, where they hoped to run a food truck together. It was the kind of dream that thrives on spontaneity and optimism. By June 2021, Elle was working as a private chef at an Airbnb property known as The Hole, located between Yucca Valley and Morongo Valley, just outside Joshua Tree National Park. The desert landscape was beautiful but unforgiving. Miles of open land, rocky hills, and extreme temperatures that could quickly turn dangerous. On the day she vanished, tensions had reportedly been building. According to the housekeeper at the Airbnb, both Elle and Orell had started drinking early in the day. An argument broke out after Orell allegedly refused to let her drive away. What happened next would become the center of confusion and speculation. Orell later told authorities that around 3 p.m., after he went inside their converted bus, Elle became upset and walked off without her phone, without food, and without water, into the desert heat. He claimed he searched for her with friends before calling the local sheriff's office at approximately 5:13 p.m. for help. But something about the search raised questions. The initial search party reportedly found no footprints belonging to Elle, only the tracks of those looking for her. In desert terrain, footprints can disappear quickly due to wind and loose sand, yet the absence of any trace intensified uncertainty. Orell suggested she may have gotten into a vehicle with someone, noting that she had plans to meet an unknown individual later that week. Still, there was no confirmed sighting of her entering a car. The last known visual of her showed her walking away from where she was staying, wearing a yellow t-shirt and jean shorts near Benmar Trail and Hooper Road, just off California State Route 62. Then nothing. Law enforcement launched a search almost immediately. Deputies combed the desert on foot. K-9 units were deployed. Helicopters scanned the terrain from above. Fixed-wing aircraft flew over the vast landscape, searching for any sign of movement, clothing, or remains. The Morongo Basin Sheriff Station initially indicated there was no evidence of foul play and suggested she might be voluntarily missing. As weeks turned into months, the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department Specialized Investigations Division joined the case in September 2021, expanding efforts. Meanwhile, friends and family took to social media, sharing missing posters, organizing awareness campaigns, and posting flyers in Bombay Beach. They refused to let her name disappear into the desert wind. Then, on October 9th, 2021, nearly 4 months after she vanished, investigators searching the rugged terrain of Yucca Valley discovered unidentified human remains. The location was remote, difficult to access, and consistent with the harsh environment where survival without supplies would be nearly impossible. On October 28, 2021, authorities confirmed the remains belonged to Lauren L. Cho. The autopsy listed the cause and manner of death as undetermined and unknown. Toxicology reports detected only caffeine and alprazolam. There were no definitive answers about how she died, whether exposure played a role, or whether any other factors contributed. Officially, the case remained surrounded by unanswered questions. Her death reignited public debate, not only about what happened in those final hours, but about media attention itself. Around the same time, the disappearance and death of Gabby Petito dominated national headlines. Many observers pointed out similarities between the two cases: young women, road trips, remote locations. Yet the level of coverage was dramatically different. Critics accused media outlets of bias, arguing that some cases received disproportionate attention while others struggle to gain national visibility. L's family addressed these comparisons publicly, stating that while surface similarities existed, the circumstances of the two cases were not the same and that the differences ran deeper than what the public could see. To this day, the mystery surrounding Lauren Cho's final moments remains unresolved. Did she wander into the desert alone, disoriented and emotional after an argument? Did she encounter someone else on that remote road? Was it a tragic accident? Or is there more beneath the surface? The open desert keeps its secrets well, and without witnesses or definitive forensic conclusions, speculation continues. Lauren L. Cho left behind family, friends, and a community still searching for clarity. Her story is not just about disappearance. It is about how quickly a life can vanish in vast, unforgiving landscapes, and how easily unanswered cases can fade without sustained public attention. If this story moved you, share your thoughts respectfully below. Do you believe the desert alone explains what happened? Or do you think critical details remain hidden? Subscribe for more in-depth true crime stories that go beyond headlines and explore the human stories behind them. Case 4 in the quiet Appalachian town of Rupert, West Virginia. A child was born into hardship and tragedy that would shape a life filled with pain, violence, and eventually unspeakable crimes. Michael Lee Bowles came into the world in Clifton Forge, Virginia, shortly after his father, a coal miner named Frank, had passed away from black lung disease. Raised by a mother, Frances, who remarried multiple times, Bowles endured a tumultuous childhood. His second stepfather was a violent alcoholic who subjected him, his mother, and his older brother to years of abuse. By the age of 13, Bowles had reached a breaking point. In a desperate act of self-defense and rebellion, he severely injured his stepfather and soon left home, feeling abandoned and betrayed by a mother who chose to remain in the abusive marriage. For years afterward, he was homeless, surviving on the streets and earning money as a sex worker to men, navigating a life marked by instability, trauma, and survival in its rawest form. In 1982, Bowles' violent tendencies escalated into criminal acts that landed him behind bars. He was arrested for beating and sexually assaulting his girlfriend, resulting in a 6-year prison sentence. Upon his release in 1991, he was convicted of unarmed robbery after stealing an elderly woman's purse, for which he received a 4-year sentence but served only 2. By this point, Bowles had already experienced a cycle of abuse, abandonment, and imprisonment that would later manifest in a pattern of predatory behavior. After his release, he moved to Daytona Beach, Florida, and attempted to rebuild a semblance of normal life. He moved in with a girlfriend and resumed working as a prostitute, but bitterness and resentment simmered beneath the surface. When his girlfriend became pregnant and chose to have an abortion upon discovering his occupation, Bowles' anger intensified, and he later claimed to law enforcement that he blamed gay men for the loss, a motive that would soon spiral into a deadly pattern of violence. The first known murder committed by Bowles occurred on March 15, 1994, when he killed 59-year-old John Hardy Roberts in Daytona Beach. Roberts had offered Bowles a temporary place to stay, but Bowles turned that trust into a fatal encounter. He beat and strangled Roberts, then stole his credit card and used it across multiple states, including Georgia and Tennessee. Law enforcement quickly became aware of Bowles as a suspect, finding his fingerprints and probation records at the scene. Over the next 6 months, Bowles embarked on a terrifying killing spree that spanned several states. He murdered 4 more men: 39-year-old David Jarman in Wheaton, Maryland, 72-year-old Milton Bradley in Savannah, Georgia, 47-year-old Alverson Carter Jr. in Atlanta, Georgia, and 37-year-old Albert Morris in Hilliard, Florida. His modus operandi remained chillingly consistent. He would prostitute himself to lure victims, then violently beat and strangle them before stealing their financial information to fund his movements. By 1994, Bowles' crimes had drawn national attention. Placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, he became one of the country's most notorious murderers, pursued relentlessly across state lines. His capture came on November 22, 1994, in Jacksonville Beach, Florida, where he was arrested for the murder of Walter Jamel J. Hinton. During interrogation, Bowles confessed to all 6 known murders. In his own words, the string of killings was fueled by a combination of personal trauma, resentment, and a twisted vendetta born from his perception of betrayal and injustice. He detailed how the abortion of his girlfriend's pregnancy had become a focal point for his anger, which he ultimately projected onto his victims. The legal proceedings that followed were long and complex. In May 1996, Bowles pleaded guilty to killing Hinton, who had been bludgeoned with a 40-pound stepping stone and suffocated with a towel. He was sentenced to death. Over the next several years, he pleaded guilty to additional murders, and his death sentence was contested and eventually reinstated after a review by the Florida Supreme Court regarding the prejudicial evidence presented at trial. In 1999, Bowles was once again sentenced to death, cementing his place in the annals of the state's criminal history. On August 22, 2019, Michael Lee Bowles' life and his reign of terror came to a definitive end. Executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison near Rayford, he requested a last meal of 3 cheeseburgers, French fries, and bacon, a mundane and ordinary choice in stark contrast to the extraordinary horror of his crimes. Bowles' execution marked the conclusion of one of Florida's most notorious murder cases and remained the state's last execution until February 23, 2023, when Donald Dilbeck was put to death. His story serves as a grim reminder of how childhood trauma, untreated mental health issues, and cycles of abuse can escalate into violence, leaving behind a trail of loss, grief, and unanswered questions that haunt the families of victims for decades. Michael Lee Bowles' life and crimes are a chilling study in the making of a serial killer. The convergence of early abuse, unresolved anger, and calculated predation. His victims, their families, and the communities affected were forever changed. If this case resonates with you, subscribe to follow more in-depth explorations of true crime, where we uncover not just what happened, but the psychological and emotional forces that drive the most dangerous individuals. Share your thoughts below. How can communities better identify and intervene before trauma transforms into tragedy? Case 5 in the early 2000s, the quiet towns and rural stretches of Peoria and Tazewell counties in Illinois became the unseen backdrop for a series of horrifying crimes that would remain hidden from public view for years. Larry Bright, a man who outwardly appeared ordinary, began spending increasing amounts of time around sex workers, taking a particular interest in African American women. Behind closed doors, however, he was cultivating impulses that would ultimately lead to a chilling pattern of violence. Bright's interactions with these women were often predatory, fueled by anger, resentment, and a disturbing desire for control, a darkness that would soon transform from intimidation to murder. Between March 2001 and October 2004, the bodies of 6 women were discovered in remote areas, with 4 others reported missing. The victims, many of whom were involved in sex work, had been lured into situations where trust was exploited and vulnerability became fatal. In October 2004, law enforcement formed a 13-officer task force, drawing support from the Illinois State Police and neighboring agencies to investigate the growing number of disappearances and murders. The breakthrough came later that year when Vicki Bomer, a 35-year-old sex worker arrested for theft, agreed to speak with police in exchange for a plea bargain. Bomer described a terrifying encounter from July of that year, claiming that Bright had lured her into an outbuilding at his mother's home, sharing alcohol and drugs before attempting to rape her at knife point. Despite the incident occurring months prior, her testimony cast a crucial light on Bright's behavior, showing a pattern of aggression and predation that law enforcement could no longer ignore. Authorities detained Bright in December 2004, interrogating him under the threat of charges for illegal deprivation of liberty under aggravated circumstances. He denied all allegations and was released temporarily due to insufficient evidence. However, in January 2005, a search warrant allowed police to examine his property thoroughly. While initially dismissed by his mother as the result of gardening efforts, several plots of excavated land drew officers' attention. Upon digging, they uncovered ashes and numerous small bone fragments. Forensic examination confirmed these remains were human, leading to Bright's immediate detention. Under the weight of overwhelming evidence, he ultimately confessed to the murders of 8 women. Bright's victims were predominantly women involved in sex work, and each murder revealed the calculated and predatory methods he employed. His first known victim, 30-year-old Sabrina Payne, was picked up on the outskirts of Peoria under the pretense of paid companionship. Bright later admitted he had no memory of her death due to intoxication, though autopsy findings indicated strangulation. Her body was transported to a cornfield outside Tremont, where it was discovered months later. Subsequent victims suffered similarly brutal fates. In August 2004, 33-year-old Laura Lawler was strangled during intercourse and burned in the backyard of Bright's residence. In September, 40-year-old Linda Kay Neal was offered drugs in exchange for sex, then strangled after taking crack cocaine, her body discarded on a roadside in Tazewell County. DNA evidence collected after Bright's arrest confirmed his involvement in Neal's death. Bright's last confirmed murder, that of 41-year-old Brenda Irving on October 14, 2004, showcased both his escalating violence and the danger posed when victims resisted. Despite Irving's attempts to flee and fight back, Bright overpowered her, striking her repeatedly before strangling her and abandoning her near a dairy farm in Peoria County. During his trial, Bright entered a plea bargain, confessing to the murders in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. On May 30, 2006, he received 8 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. His confessions also included claims of additional murders across Wisconsin, Oklahoma, Washington, and Arizona, though he later retracted these statements. Bright revealed a disturbing psychological profile, expressing urges toward violence and contemplating suicide, yet abstaining due to religious beliefs. He also admitted that he had intended to provoke his arresting officers into shooting him, but refrained because his mother was present. Bright's stated motives for the killings shifted over time, reflecting both personal trauma and complex psychological rationalizations. He initially claimed misogyny toward African American women developed after contracting HIV/AIDS from a sex worker, a theory disproved after testing negative. Later, he attributed his violent impulses to abuse he suffered while incarcerated as a teenager, stating that African American prisoners had sexually abused him, generating a desire to punish black men. Over time, he redirected this hatred toward female sex workers, the group he ultimately victimized. Regardless of motive, the pattern of exploitation, predation, and brutal murder left a permanent scar on the communities of Peoria and Tazewell counties, highlighting the tragic intersection of vulnerability, trust, and unchecked violence. Case 6 David Dowler was born in 1953 in Albuquerque, New Mexico, into a family that seemed at first glance ordinary, yet carried its own unique pressures and complexities. As the elder son of a United States Air Force colonel and his Japanese wife, Dowler grew up under the disciplined shadow of military life. Family members described him as a caring and bright boy, one who excelled academically and physically. At Sandia High School, he distinguished himself not only in the classroom, but also on the wrestling mat and in martial arts, eventually earning a black belt in karate. His brother will recall David's fascination with electronics and ham radio, noting one particular instance in which he helped law enforcement and firefighters maintain communication after a riot had disrupted telephone lines in Albuquerque. These early experiences painted a picture of a young man who was intelligent, resourceful, and at times heroic. Yet underlying this promising exterior were complexities that would later manifest in dark and tragic ways. After high school, David pursued higher education at the University of New Mexico, enrolling in courses spanning electrical engineering, physics, chemistry, and mathematics. Despite his evident aptitude, he failed to complete a degree, a pattern that hinted at a restlessness and dissatisfaction that would follow him into adulthood. In 1976, he married Janet, and together they had 2 daughters. The early years of their marriage seemed typical, and the family eventually moved to Midland, Texas in the early 1980s, where David began working as a sales representative at Daniel Industries. Yet even amidst what appeared to be a stable career and family life, his personal connections and friendships began to entwine with people whose lives would later intersect with tragedy. It was in Midland and Odessa that David met Lisa Blythe-Krieg, Liza Chandler, a local teacher, and Juan Antonio Tony Casillas, Chandler's ex-husband. His relationships with these individuals would ultimately become the focal points of a disturbing sequence of deaths that authorities would struggle to unravel for years. The first in this series of deaths occurred on August 16, 1983, when 26-year-old Lisa Krieg was found dead in her home. Krieg, it was discovered during her autopsy, had been struggling with anorexia, though investigators were initially unable to determine whether this condition had contributed to her death. That very day, Dowler reportedly called Lisa's ex-husband, Tim Krieg, claiming that Lisa had committed suicide by ingesting cyanide he had provided her, and that he had cleaned the scene so her death would appear natural. Dowler's narrative of being an undercover FBI agent working with Lisa, combined with claims that he had thwarted assassins sent to kill her, painted a surreal picture of a man capable of weaving elaborate, convincing stories to justify horrifying actions. Tim Krieg, unsure whether to believe these extraordinary claims and fearful of being labeled delusional, did not notify law enforcement at the time, allowing David's ominous behavior to go unchecked. Years later, the pattern of suspicious deaths continued. On February 12, 1986, the body of 28-year-old Tony Casillas was discovered in his home in Odessa. Toxicology reports revealed the presence of cyanide, along with small traces of poppers, commonly used as muscle relaxants. As with Lisa Krieg, authorities could not immediately determine a precise cause of death, prompting further testing and investigation. The following year, on June 29, 1987, Liza Chandler, a 29-year-old teacher and friend of Dowler, was found dead in her home by Carrie Dawn Middleton, who had traveled from Midland to visit her. The autopsy revealed acute chloroform poisoning, with investigators concluding the death was likely homicidal. Further inquiries into Chandler's social circle uncovered that she and her friends, including Dowler, had occasionally inhaled chloroform recreationally as a way to relax and discuss personal issues. Rumors of a romantic involvement between Chandler and Dowler surfaced, intensifying scrutiny and ultimately leading authorities to view him as a prime suspect. In September 1987, formal charges were filed against Dowler for the death of Liza Chandler. In addition to murder charges, authorities cited his possession of 2 illegal sound suppressors, setting bail at $100,000. The investigation expanded to consider the deaths of 3 other acquaintances, including 29-year-old Kathy Hicks, who collapsed at an arts and crafts show in 1986. While Hicks' death was later attributed to heart complications and ruled unrelated, the cumulative pattern of suspicious fatalities raised significant concern. To those who knew him, the accusations were jarring. Family members maintained that David was gentle, incapable of harming anyone, and that he must have been framed. Outwardly, he appeared as the same conscientious, intelligent man who had once assisted authorities during a crisis in Albuquerque. The pre-trial and trial phases delved into the details of Dowler's alleged crimes. Investigators found 2 pint bottles of chloroform in his West Louisiana Street residence, evidence that prosecutors argued linked him to Chandler's death. Defense attorney Thomas Hirsch challenged this assertion, arguing that Dowler had used the chemicals to create fireworks and suggesting that Chandler's ex-husband, Kyle, might have been responsible. Testimonies from witnesses, including Pat Carter, who occasionally worked in Dowler's shop, indicated that while friends had experimented with chloroform socially, they had never observed David administering it to anyone. On the prosecution side, Dr. Juan Garcia, a psychiatrist, testified regarding Dowler's demeanor and behavioral tendencies, and Tim Krieg provided testimony regarding the calls he received following Lisa's death. On January 28, 1988, after exhaustive hearings and testimonies, David Dowler was convicted of the murder of Liza Chandler. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment, with the possibility of parole, framing the legal closure of one chapter in a web of suspicious deaths that had bewildered authorities for years. District Attorney Eric Augizan described Dowler as a vicious murderer and a cruel manipulator, with a predilection for control and extinguishing life, emphasizing the chilling capacity for calculated violence that had emerged beneath the facade of an otherwise ordinary life. Case 7 Gary Charles Evans was born on a crisp autumn day, October 7th, 1954, in Troy, New York. He arrived into a world that was already fraught with tension and instability. His father, Roy Evans, a stern and frequently violent man, ruled the household with an iron fist, directing his aggression toward both his wife, Flora May, and their children, Gary and his younger sister, Robbie. Life in the Evans household was a daily exercise in navigating fear, as Roy's violent outbursts could erupt over the smallest provocations. Yet, even amid this volatility, the household held moments of fragile normalcy, as Gary's mother attempted to shield her children from the worst of her husband's wrath, though her own struggles with mental health often left her vulnerable. The children witnessed harrowing episodes, suicide attempts by their mother, brutal punishments from their father, and the subtle erosion of stability that would carve deep psychological scars. In later years, Gary would reveal a secret so haunting it seemed to eclipse even these early traumas. He claimed he had been sexually assaulted by his father at the age of 8, an event that would profoundly shape his understanding of control, power, and fear. Even in such a tumultuous environment, Gary's precociousness and curiosity were evident. He developed an early fascination with objects of beauty and value. Jewelry, artwork, and other items that suggested a world of sophistication and privilege beyond the reach of his own troubled upbringing. By the age of 8, he had already been caught stealing jewelry worth a staggering $1,000, a deed that foreshadowed his early mastery of deception and risk. Throughout his school years, his penchant for theft continued. He pilfered books, comics, and small items from local shops, gradually earning a reputation as a clever, if troublesome, thief. These acts of larceny were more than mere childhood mischief. They were the formative exercises in manipulation, strategy, and survival that would later define his criminal endeavors. The year 1968 brought upheaval once again. His parents divorced, and Evans moved with his mother to Cohoes. Here, he attempted to navigate a semblance of normal teenage life, attending the local high school, though the scars of his early childhood weighed heavily. The summer of 1970 marked a pivotal turning point in his young life. Gary was arrested for breaking and entering, landing him in a juvenile detention center for 3 months. While he was confined, his mother's life continued in disorder. She married and divorced 4 more times, each union unraveling under the weight of her alcohol dependency. In 1971, she came out as a lesbian, an announcement that, while personally liberating for her, further complicated the emotional landscape for Gary. Upon his release, the strain at home became unbearable. He left his mother's house, severed ties with formal education, and began living as a vagrant, drifting through the streets, relying on his wits and burgeoning street smarts to survive. By the mid-1970s, Gary had returned to Troy, seeking both familiarity and opportunity. Reuniting with childhood friends Michael Falco and Timothy "Tim" Reisdorf, the trio rented a modest apartment and began laying the foundations of a partnership that would evolve into a complex criminal enterprise. Their initial forays were small-scale, involving petty thefts and minor burglaries, but these activities were executed with precision and careful planning. Evans quickly demonstrated a knack for organization and manipulation. Their apartment doubled as both a living space and a storage hub for stolen goods, highlighting the seamless integration of his criminal activities into daily life. Evans' brushes with the law intensified over the next several years. On January 13, 1977, he was arrested in Lake Placid for trespassing and theft, earning a 4-year sentence at Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora. His time in prison coincided with another blow, the death of his father from throat cancer. For Evans, this period of confinement was transformative, not rehabilitative, but sharpening his capacity for planning, endurance, and strategic thinking. Released on parole in March 1980, he returned to Troy and immediately resumed criminal activities with Falco and Reisdorf. The thefts and robberies became more audacious, and their success emboldened Evans to refine his methods, transitioning from small-scale larceny to more elaborate operations. By June 1980, Evans was again in custody for theft in Cahos. While incarcerated at the old Rensselaer County Jail, he briefly escaped with the assistance of Hell's Angels members, a testament to his ability to exploit alliances, but his freedom lasted only 5 hours before recapture. September of that year saw him return to Clinton Correctional Facility to finish serving his sentence, having violated parole conditions. The early 1980s continued to test and shape Evans. In 1982, after a violent brawl with other inmates, he was transferred to Attica Correctional Facility. Released on December 29th, he quickly reunited with Falco, resuming petty thefts before relocating temporarily to Florida. Tragedy struck again when his mother died in an accident a month later, prompting his return to New York and a continuation of criminal ventures alongside both Falco and Reisdorf. In May 1983, he was arrested for burglary and trespassing in Saratoga County. But despite repeated incarceration and transfers to various prisons, Evans eluded trial and was released in March 1984. By January 1985, Reisdorf had ended contact, leaving Evans to navigate his criminal career solely with Falco. The spring of 1985 marked a turning point. On February 16th, Evans and Falco executed a daring robbery of an antique collector's apartment in East Greenbush, netting approximately $15,000. Just 2 months later, Evans stole a car from 2 drug traffickers, selling it for $12,000. This theft drew attention from authorities, resulting in his arrest in Cahos. He accepted a plea deal, admitting guilt in exchange for a reduced sentence and a commutation. Released on probation, he promised to abandon theft and pursue legitimate employment. Yet, by July, his descent into darkness would escalate. Evans committed his first murder. In the final days of July 1985, Evans built an improvised silencer for his pistol. In an act that shocked even his accomplices, he killed Michael Falco in their shared Troy apartment. The body was dismembered with a chainsaw, demonstrating both methodical planning and cold detachment. Reisdorf assisted in disposing of the corpse, transporting it to Evans' sister's property in Lake Worth Corridor, Florida, where it was buried in the backyard. The murder was ostensibly revenge. Reisdorf had blamed Falco for diverting profits from their criminal enterprises, and Evans' actions reflected both loyalty to his distorted sense of justice and a growing capacity for violence. Following the act, the two remained in Florida for 6 weeks before returning to New York. Evans' ongoing violations of parole led to a 4-year sentence at Sing Sing, further embedding the cycle of incarceration, criminality, and planning that would define much of his adult life. Even within prison walls, Evans' personality was strikingly complex. He befriended David Berkowitz, the infamous son of Sam Killer, bonding over shared interest in bodybuilding. In December 1987, Evans' violent tendencies surfaced again when he fought a fellow inmate serving time for child molestation, earning months in solitary confinement. Released on March 1st, 1988, he quickly aligned with 27-year-old thief Damian Cuomo, and together they embarked on a new spree of thefts and robberies. Between March 1988 and September 1989, Evans and Cuomo honed their criminal operations, conducting thefts with precision. In March 1989, they were arrested with incriminating equipment in their car: ski masks, stun guns, radios, and ropes, but were released due to insufficient evidence. On September 8, 1989, during a robbery in Watertown, Evans escalated to murder, killing 63-year-old secondhand shop owner Douglas Berry before making off with approximately $15,000 in stolen goods. The act left authorities without leads, showcasing Evans' methodical approach to eliminating witnesses. By December 29th, fearing Cuomo might betray him during a depressive episode, Evans killed his partner. This pattern of eliminating potential threats would recur. In 1991, Evans murdered secondhand shop owner Gregory Jubin, stole $60,000 in items, and disposed of the murder weapon carefully at Albany Rural Cemetery, even dismantling and selling a 500 kilograms marble tombstone. Following this, he attempted a semblance of normalcy, working as a day laborer while occasionally committing minor thefts. Evans' nomadic tendencies intensified over the early 1990s. He lived as a survivalist in Vermont, stealing valuable items like cuff links and a rare book, The Birds of America, only returning them when faced with arrest. Paroled in 1996, he returned to New York, reuniting with Reisdorf and resuming criminal activity, ultimately murdering Reisdorf in October 1997, dismembering the body, and fleeing the state to avoid detection. On May 27, 1998, Evans surrendered in Vermont, confessing multiple murders and providing the locations of Falco and Reisdorf's remains. Despite the confession, his story ended tragically and bizarrely. While being transported in August, he freed himself from manacles, attempted to escape, and jumped into the Hudson River, suffering fatal injuries upon impact. His death was ruled a suicide, the final act of a life marked by violence, cunning, and a deeply conflicted psyche. Even in death, those who knew him described a man of contradictions, a vegetarian who abstained from alcohol and smoking, philosophical in his musings, yet capable of unspeakable violence. His life has since been dramatized in media, exploring the chilling intersection of intelligence, morality, and the capacity for human cruelty. By the mid-1980s, Gary Evans had evolved from a petty thief into a man capable of calculated, methodical violence. His early acts of theft had been driven by survival, rebellion, and curiosity, but the murders of Michael Falco and, later, Damian Cuomo marked a transformation that few could have foreseen. Evans' psychology was complex. He combined a sharp intellect with deep emotional scars from childhood abuse, creating a personality that could compartmentalize normal interactions while executing acts of cold-blooded violence. In July 1985, as he prepared for his first murder, Evans meticulously planned the logistics. His apartment in Troy became both a trap and a stage. Falco, who had once been a close accomplice, was now, in Evans' eyes, a liability. Using his knowledge of firearms and mechanical improvisation, Evans crafted a silencer for his pistol, ensuring that the act would leave minimal auditory evidence. On the day of the murder, he confronted Falco in their shared apartment. What followed was a chilling mixture of precision and brutality. Falco was shot, then dismembered with a chainsaw, an act that demanded both physical strength and a dispassionate mindset. The pieces of the body were carefully packaged and entrusted to Reisdorf, who transported them across state lines to Florida. There, Evans' sister's backyard became a clandestine grave. This first act of murder was not impulsive. It was deeply rooted in Evans' sense of perceived betrayal and justice. Falco, Reisdorf explained to Evans, had been skimming profit from their thefts. Whether this accusation was true or not mattered little. Evans' perception of loyalty, betrayal, and control dictated his actions. For 6 weeks, the trio lay low in Florida, the shadow of the crime looming over every interaction. When they returned to New York, Evans' life quickly fell back into familiar patterns. Minor thefts, constant vigilance to avoid law enforcement, and a growing obsession with security and planning. Evans' time in prison during the mid-1980s only sharpened these skills. While confined at Sing Sing and later other correctional facilities, he interacted with men who were hardened by life and crime. Yet he stood out even among them. He befriended David Berkowitz, the notorious Son of Sam, bonding over bodybuilding and shared intellectual pursuits. Evans absorbed lessons from prison life, learning how to manipulate systems, assess threats, and anticipate human behavior. These experiences would later manifest in the cold, calculated decisions he made while evading the law. Released in 1988, Evans wasted no time reconnecting with criminal contacts. Damian Cuomo, a skilled thief with whom Evans had previously collaborated, became his next partner in a series of escalating crimes. Between March 1988 and September 1989, the duo executed dozens of robberies and thefts, their operations growing in sophistication. Evans was careful to avoid leaving evidence. Masks, stun guns, ropes, and other tools of the trade were prepared and concealed, ready for use. Yet, the line between theft and murder was always thin in Evans' mind. On September 8, 1989, Evans crossed that line again. During a robbery in Watertown, he encountered Douglas Berry, a 63-year-old secondhand shop owner. Evans shot Berry, killing him, and appropriated $15,000 in stolen merchandise. The act was clinical, devoid of overt rage. There were no witnesses, no immediate evidence. It was a precise elimination of a risk, carried out with chilling calm. Shortly thereafter, paranoia intensified. By December of the same year, Evans feared that Cuomo, who suffered from depressive episodes, might betray their activities to authorities. Acting preemptively, Evans killed him, removing yet another perceived threat. The 1990s ushered in a period of transient existence and nomadic survival. Evans moved from New York to Florida and then California, always on the move, always seeking opportunities, and simultaneously avoiding scrutiny. In California, a personal encounter with an old acquaintance escalated into threats after she refused his sexual advances. Rather than face criminal charges, Evans opted to leave the state, a decision consistent with his pattern of avoiding direct consequences while pursuing self-interest. October 17, 1991, marked another calculated act of murder. Evans killed Gregory Jubin, a secondhand shop owner, in a premeditated robbery that netted $60,000. This murder, like the others, displayed his meticulous nature. The weapon was buried at the Albany Rural Cemetery, and Evans even dismantled and sold a massive marble tombstone to cover financial tracks. Following this, he attempted to reintegrate into society, working sporadically as a day laborer and committing minor thefts to supplement his income. By 1993, Evans' lifestyle became increasingly isolated and survivalist. In Vermont, he lived in a tent, scavenging and stealing valuable items to sustain himself. Among his thefts were cuff links valued at $1,500 and a rare, highly prized book, The Birds of America, from the Norman Williams Library. Despite these criminal acts, Evans returned the book intact when confronted, suggesting a complex moral compass, a mix of greed, cunning, and selective ethics. Arrested in June 1994 for this theft, he faced life imprisonment, but cooperation and restitution mitigated the sentence, reflecting his ability to negotiate outcomes in his favor. After parole in 1996, Evans returned to New York and re-established contact with Reisdorf, renting storage space for tools and stolen goods. Yet, the specter of past betrayals haunted him. Knowing Reisdorf had been complicit in Falco's murder 12 years prior, Evans' paranoia intensified. On October 3, 1997, he killed Reisdorf, dismembering and burying the body in a wooded area, disposing of the weapon meticulously. Once again, Evans demonstrated his calculated approach to violence, eliminating potential threats before they could compromise him, maintaining control over both his environment and his perceived enemies. Evans' life of crime eventually led to surrender. On May 27, 1998, he turned himself into the St. Johnsbury, Vermont police, confessing multiple murders and providing precise locations for Falco and Reisdorf's remains. His motivations were steeped in guilt, particularly as he had observed the emotional and behavioral toll on Reisdorf's young son, whose aggression and withdrawal haunted Evans' conscience. Over the next month, Evans detailed each crime with chilling clarity, revealing both the methods and the meticulous planning behind his acts. Yet even in custody, Evans' story ended in dramatic fashion. On August 12, 1998, during transport to court proceedings, he utilized a secret key hidden in his nose to free himself from manacles. Breaking the transport van window, he leaped into the Hudson River. The fall and subsequent collision with shallow waters caused fatal head injuries. Authorities ruled the death a suicide, though it bore the hallmarks of his lifelong penchant for control and audacity. Those who knew Evans described him with a mixture of fear, fascination, and bewilderment. Despite his capacity for extreme violence, he maintained a vegetarian lifestyle, abstained from alcohol and tobacco, and was noted for philosophical musings and intellectual curiosity. Friends and acquaintances recalled his moral complexity, capable of loyalty and friendship, yet willing to commit calculated, lethal acts when he felt betrayed or threatened. His life, punctuated by violence, cunning, and occasional glimpses of intellect and ethics, has since been dramatized in media, notably in the I Killed My BFF series. Books and investigative accounts explore his crimes in depth, documenting the life of a man who straddled the line between human vulnerability and extraordinary cruelty. Evans' story remains a chilling portrait of how trauma, intelligence, and moral ambiguity can combine to create a life both compelling and horrifying. Case 8 Nanny came into the world on a crisp November day in 1905 in the small town of Blue Mountain, Alabama, which today is part of Anniston. She was one of 5 sisters with a brother, growing up in a household run by her father, James F. Hazel, and her mother, Louisa Lou Holder. Early on, her father worked the railroads, but by the time Nanny was in her teens, he had taken full control of the family farm, shaping the daily lives of everyone in the household. Life at home was far from gentle. Nanny and her mother shared a quiet, simmering anger toward James, whose domineering and often cruel ways left a lasting mark. School was a luxury rarely afforded to the children, as James demanded their labor on the farm from sunrise to sunset. The relentless work left Nanny struggling with her studies, and her academic skills suffered under the weight of a childhood overshadowed by control and fear. When Nanny was just 7, she and her family were traveling by train to visit relatives in southern Alabama. Suddenly, the train lurched to a stop, and in the chaos, Nanny's head struck a hard metal bar on the seat in front of her. The impact left a mark that would last for years. Persistent, searing headaches, blackouts, and deep bouts of depression that she later attributed to that single accident. Even amid such hardship, Nanny found small escapes. She loved curling up with her mother's romance magazines, imagining lives filled with love and adventure far beyond the strict confines of her own home. The Lonely Hearts column became a particular fascination, a place where she could dream of connection and warmth. Yet at home, life remained stifling. Her father, convinced that appearance led to danger, forbade his daughters from wearing makeup or stylish clothes, claiming it would protect them from male attention. Despite these precautions, Nanny endured horrific violations in her childhood, assaults her father refused to acknowledge. Social gatherings, dances, and outings were also banned, cutting her off from the world of her peers and leaving her imagination as one of the few places she could breathe. At just 16, Nanny entered into her first marriage with Charlie Braggs, a young man she had met while working alongside him at a linen factory. Their courtship lasted barely 4 months, but with her father's blessing, they tied the knot in 1921. Charlie was the only child of a single mother, and even after their marriage, his mother insisted on maintaining her presence in their home, gradually taking control over many aspects of Nanny's life. Reflecting on this period later, Nanny recalled how overwhelming it felt to be married so young, to someone she barely knew, and under the shadow of a mother-in-law who ruled the household. Her own mother's role was minimized, often not even allowed to stay overnight, and Nanny felt caught between loyalty to her husband and the pressures of the woman who now dominated their home. Bragg's mother loomed over Nanny's married life, drawing much of Charlie's attention and leaving Nanny with little freedom or control over her own days. The couple had 4 daughters in quick succession between 1923 and 1927, each birth adding pressure to an already strained household. The constant stress weighed heavily on Nanny, and she began to seek solace in alcohol, which quickly escalated from occasional drinking into a serious habit. Smoking, which had once been casual, became a daily crutch as she tried to cope with the demands and disappointments of her life. The marriage was fraught with tension and mistrust. Both Nanny and Charlie suspected the other of infidelity, and his frequent absences, sometimes lasting days at a time, only deepened the emotional distance between them. In 1927, tragedy struck when their two middle daughters died under suspicious circumstances, believed to be food poisoning. The loss shattered Nanny, leaving her grief-stricken and overwhelmed. Not long after, Charlie took their eldest daughter, Melvina, and disappeared, leaving behind the newborn Florine. Nanny was left alone, responsible for the baby and herself, while navigating the heartache of losing two children and the sudden absence of her husband. When Bragg's mother passed away shortly afterward, Nanny found herself needing to provide for her young daughter, taking work in a cotton mill, a physically demanding job that offered little comfort but a chance to survive. In the summer of 1928, Charlie returned Melvina, not alone, but with a divorcee and her own child, further complicating Nanny's life. The return of her eldest daughter did not mend their fractured relationship, and divorce soon followed. Nanny reclaimed her children, moving back in with her own mother for support. Charlie would later claim that his departure had been motivated by fear of Nanny, an explanation that may have offered him solace, but did little to heal the wounds she carried from those years. Nanny's second marriage was to Robert Franklin Harrelson, whom she married in 1929, and they settled in Jacksonville with her daughters Melvina and Florine. Early in the marriage, she discovered that Robert struggled with alcoholism and had a criminal record for assault. Yet the marriage endured for 16 years. During this time, Melvina gave birth to a son, Robert Lee Haynes, in 1943, and 2 years later, she had another child who died shortly after birth under mysterious circumstances. Exhausted from labor and groggy from ether, Melvina thought she saw her mother stick a hat pin into the baby's head, and when she sought clarification from her husband and sister, they told her that Nanny had said the baby was already dead and had been holding a pin, but doctors could offer no explanation. The loss strained Melvina and her husband, who drifted apart, and Melvina began seeing a soldier, much to Nanny's disapproval. During a visit to her father after a bitter argument with Nanny, her son Robert died mysteriously on July 7, 1945, while in his grandmother's care. The death was officially recorded as asphyxia from unknown causes, and just 2 months later, Nanny collected the $500 life insurance she had taken out on the boy. In 1945, following an alleged sexual assault by Robert Harrelson, Nanny reportedly laced his corn whiskey with rat poison, leading to his death that very evening. Later, she met her third husband, Arlie Lanning, through a Lonely Hearts column while traveling in Lexington, North Carolina, and married him just 3 days after meeting him. Lanning, like Harrelson, was an alcoholic and womanizer, but in this marriage, Nanny frequently disappeared for extended periods. When she was home, she maintained the appearance of a devoted housewife, and upon Lanning's death from what was said to be heart failure, the local community attended his funeral in support of her. Soon after, the couple's house, which had been inherited by Lanning's sister, burned down, and Nanny quickly collected and banked the insurance money. Not long after, Lanning's mother died in her sleep, and Nanny left North Carolina, eventually arriving at her bedridden sister Dubby's home, who died shortly after Nanny's arrival. Seeking another husband, Nanny joined a dating service called the Diamond Circle Club, where she met Richard L. Morton from Jamestown, North Carolina. The couple married in 1952 in Emporia, Kansas. Unlike some of her previous husbands, Morton did not struggle with alcohol, but he was unfaithful. Before targeting Morton, Nanny allegedly poisoned her own mother, Louisa, in January 1953 when she came to live with them. Just 3 months later, on May 19, 1953, Morton died under suspicious circumstances. In June 1953, Nanny married Samuel Doss from Tulsa, Oklahoma, a Nazarene minister who had tragically lost his family in a tornado in Carroll County, Arkansas. Samuel disapproved of Nanny's passion for romance novels and stories. In September of the following year, he was admitted to the hospital with flu-like symptoms and diagnosed with a severe digestive tract infection. He was treated and released on October 5th, but on October 12th, 1954, Samuel suddenly died. Nanny had poisoned him that evening, eager to claim the 2 life insurance policies she had taken out on him. The unexpected death raised suspicion, prompting his doctor to order an autopsy, which revealed a large amount of arsenic in his system. Nanny was immediately arrested. Nanny Doss admitted to murdering 4 of her husbands, her mother, her sister, her grandson, and her mother-in-law, though the state of Oklahoma focused its case solely on the death of Samuel Doss. Prosecuted by J. Howard Edmondson, who would later become governor, she pled guilty on May 17, 1955, and was sentenced to life in prison. Authorities chose not to seek the death penalty because of her gender, and she was never charged for her other killings. Nanny Doss died of leukemia in 1965 while incarcerated at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary and was laid to rest at Oak Hill Memorial Park in McAlester, Oklahoma. Case 9 Billy Wayne Waldrop was born on February 6, 1952, in Alabama. From an early age, he found himself on the wrong side of the law, building a criminal record that spanned over a decade. During the 1970s and 1980s, he was repeatedly arrested for offenses ranging from assault to larceny and even attempted murder. By 1982, his notoriety had grown so much that Georgia authorities were actively seeking him for the kidnapping of a 10-year-old girl in Atlanta. In March 1972, Waldrop faced legal consequences for the first time for serious theft. He was convicted on 2 counts of auto larceny and received a 2-year prison sentence. However, he struggled with confinement and seized an opportunity to escape on April 29, 1973, during a work release program, setting the stage for the more violent crimes that would soon follow. On a quiet June day in 1973, the lives of J.R. Carter, 58, and his 60-year-old cousin Clarence Ralph Snyder came to a violent and horrifying end at the hands of 21-year-old Billy Wayne Waldrop in Calhoun County, Alabama. The 2 men, who had shared both family ties and a home in the Blue Mountain neighborhood, never imagined the danger that awaited them. Waldrop entered the house with a cold and calculated intent, quickly overpowering the cousins. He bound their hands and blindfolded them, stripping away any chance of resistance or escape. What followed was a vicious attack, in which he repeatedly stabbed both men, leaving their bodies not only lifeless, but also mutilated in a grotesque display of rage. To mark the crime as unmistakably his own, Waldrop carved his initials, B.W.W., into one of the victim's corpses, an act that spoke to a chilling sense of pride and possession over his violence. The brutality of the murders sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community, leaving neighbors horrified and authorities scrambling to piece together the shocking series of events that had turned an ordinary household into a scene of unspeakable horror. Just 2 days after the shocking killings, authorities tracked down Billy Wayne Waldrop and arrested him on June 28, 1973, charging him with the brutal murders of J.R. Carter and Clarence Ralph Snyder, as well as his recent escape from a work release program. The arrest seemed to unnerve Waldrop, who reportedly slashed his wrists in an apparent suicide attempt shortly after being taken into custody, signaling both his desperation and the weight of his actions. By August, a grand jury in Calhoun County formally indicted him. Yet even under legal scrutiny, Waldrop made another attempt on his life, this time using a razor to cut his arms and stomach. Facing the grim prospect of the death penalty, he and his attorneys struck a deal with prosecutors. In exchange for pleading guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder, he would receive a prison term of 15 years for each count. When the hearing took place on October 3, 1973, Waldrop entered his guilty pleas and was convicted accordingly. However, the sentencing brought an unexpected twist. For Snyder's murder, the jury imposed a 20-year term, 5 years longer than the plea agreement had stipulated, while the sentence for Carter's death ran concurrently at 15 years, formalizing the grim consequences of Waldrop's violent spree and setting the stage for his years behind bars. After serving several years behind bars, Waldrop sought to challenge his conviction, filing an appeal to overturn his guilty plea and sentence for the murder of Clarence Ralph Snyder. On October 3rd, 1974, the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals sided with him, acknowledging that the jury's decision to impose a 20-year sentence, 5 years longer than the agreed-upon 15 years, violated the terms of his plea deal. The court ordered a new trial hearing, giving Waldrop another chance to formally enter a plea for the crime. Over a year later, on November 15, 1975, he again pleaded guilty to second-degree murder for Snyder's death. This second plea resulted in a 15-year sentence, which was set to run concurrently with his existing term for the murder of J.R. Carter. Despite the severity of his crimes, Waldrop served only a fraction of his combined sentences, gaining release on January 3, 1981, after serving just over 7.5 years, stepping back into the world that had once labeled him a dangerous murderer. On June 3, 1982, barely over a year after regaining his freedom, Billy Waldrop, along with 2 accomplices, William Eugene Singleton and Henry Leslie Mays, carried out a brutal crime in Talladega County, Alabama. The 3 men targeted 72-year-old Thurman Macon Donahue Sr., believing he possessed a valuable 5-carat diamond ring. Breaking into Donahue's home with plans to steal his valuables, they escalated their intentions to murder, attacking the elderly man and shooting him fatally in the head. Their greed didn't stop there. They rifled through the house, taking the diamond ring, family silver, and Donahue's firearms. To cover their tracks and destroy evidence, the trio set fire to Donahue's century-old home before fleeing. When authorities arrived, they discovered the charred remains of Donahue, crushed beneath an overturned refrigerator, his body nearly unrecognizable from the violence and fire, a chilling testament to the calculated brutality of Waldrop and his accomplices. The day following Thurman Donahue's murder, Billy Waldrop and Henry Leslie Mays fled across state lines to Tennessee, attempting to convert their stolen loot into quick cash. They managed to sell some of the items, including the diamond ring, for approximately $10,000, though law enforcement later recovered the ring. In July 1982, Waldrop's freedom came to an abrupt halt when he was arrested in California for a DUI. Investigators quickly connected him to Donahue's brutal killing, leading to his extradition back to Alabama. While detained in the Talladega County Jail, Waldrop gave 2 separate statements in which he admitted to his involvement in the robbery, burglary, and murder. Following these confessions, authorities charged him with 6 counts of capital murder, for linked to first-degree robbery and 2 tied to first-degree burglary. The case proceeded rapidly, and by February 1983, Waldrop's trial was underway before a jury in Talladega County, setting the stage for a high-profile courtroom drama. On February 18, 1983, after days of testimony and evidence review, the jury delivered a decisive verdict, finding Billy Waldrop guilty of capital murder on all counts. The same day, they unanimously recommended that he receive the death penalty, citing the cold-blooded nature of the crimes and the calculated planning behind them. About a month later, on March 22nd, Circuit Court Judge William Sullivan formally imposed the sentence, agreeing with the jury that death was the only fitting punishment for Waldrop's violent and remorseless actions. Meanwhile, the fates of his accomplices diverged. William Eugene Singleton, arrested in 1983, was convicted in 1984 for burglary and conspiracy to commit robbery and murder, receiving a life sentence for the conspiracy along with 175 years for the burglary charges. He was eventually paroled in 1994 after serving 10 years of his life term. Henry Leslie Mays evaded capture for 5 years, but was apprehended in 1987. However, he died in prison while awaiting trial, never facing justice for his role in the murder and robbery. In January 1983, just 2 months before his formal death sentence, Billy Waldrop struck again, this time inside the confines of the Talladega County Jail. He attacked a fellow inmate, Ray Anthony Thompson, who served as a trustee responsible for laundering the prisoner's clothes. Waldrop stabbed Thompson in the neck, narrowly missing the jugular vein and carotid artery, leaving the victim seriously injured but alive. The assault demonstrated Waldrop's continued violence even while awaiting execution. By April 1983, a month after he had been sentenced to death for the murder of Thurman Donahue, Waldrop faced trial for this stabbing and was convicted of attempted murder, receiving a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole to run alongside his death sentence. Waldrop sought to overturn this conviction, but his appeal was rejected on March 20th, 1984, leaving him with both the ultimate penalty and an additional life term for his brutal attack inside the jail. During his first year on death row, Billy Wayne Waldrop's violent past came back in the spotlight when he was linked to an attempted murder that had occurred in Forest, Mississippi, an incident for which another man had already been wrongfully convicted. In July 1982, Lawrence Anderson, who ran the Billups service station along Highway 35 South, had been seriously injured when a bullet struck his face during a brazen armed robbery. At the time, police apprehended a hitchhiker found near the scene, Charles Henry Thomas, who was charged and convicted by a jury for aggravated assault, receiving a 17-year sentence in a Mississippi state prison. The case against Thomas began to unravel in September 1982 when Waldrop confessed to his role in the robbery and shooting. Following his admission, investigators from Talladega, Alabama, where Waldrop was incarcerated, worked closely with Mississippi authorities to re-examine the evidence. It became clear that Thomas's alleged co-conspirators had previously testified that he was not involved in the crime. Further corroborating Waldrop's confession, Anderson's 10-year-old son, the eyewitness who had originally identified Thomas, later confirmed that it was Waldrop, not Thomas, who had fired the shot that injured his father when shown a photograph of Waldrop. This revelation highlighted not only Waldrop's dangerous history, but also the miscarriage of justice that had wrongly imprisoned Thomas. Charles Henry Thomas was finally released from prison after serving roughly 18 months, the victim of a wrongful conviction. Even after Waldrop admitted his involvement in the assault on Lawrence Anderson, authorities never pursued charges against him for that specific crime, leaving a sense of unfinished justice in its wake. While on death row, Waldrop repeatedly attempted to draw attention to his claims of innocence, most notably through hunger strikes. In 1986, he refused food for 3 months, a protest that ultimately landed him in the hospital due to the severe toll it took on his body. A year later, in June 1987, he launched a second hunger strike, lasting until July, which coincided with his failed escape attempt from Holman Correctional Facility, underscoring both his desperation and defiance. Throughout his time on death row, Waldrop fought multiple appeals to overturn his sentence. On November 29, 1983, the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals dismissed his first direct appeal. This was followed by a rejection from the U.S. Supreme Court on April 15, 1985, and another denial by the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals on April 28, 1987. Years later, on June 9, 1994, U.S. District Judge James Hughes Hancock of the Northern District of Alabama dismissed yet another appeal. And finally, on February 26, 1996, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals turned down his last effort to challenge the death sentence. Despite these repeated failures, Waldrop's persistence in contesting his punishment demonstrated his unwavering, albeit troubled, determination to fight against the fate imposed upon him. After exhausting every possible legal appeal, 44-year-old Billy Wayne Waldrop faced the finality of his death sentence, which was set for January 10, 1997. As the day of execution approached, emotions ran high, not only for Waldrop, but for the families affected by his crimes. Dottie Jackson, the daughter of Thurman Donahue, expressed a complicated mix of feelings. She hoped that witnessing the execution of her father's killer would bring some measure of closure, though she also held onto a cautious hope that Waldrop had found genuine repentance through his public commitment to Christianity while on death row. Jackson's attendance was historically significant. With a 1996 change in Alabama law, families of murder victims were allowed to witness the execution of the convicted killer, and she became the first family member in the state to take part as an official execution witness. Despite the gravity of the moment and the presence of the victim's family, Waldrop himself remained steadfast in his claims of innocence, insisting that the real shooter in Donahue's murder was his former accomplice, William Singleton, who had been released from prison by this time. The scene highlighted a stark contrast between the search for justice, the hope for closure, and the lingering questions surrounding Waldrop's own narrative of the crimes. On the early morning of January 10th, 1997, just shy of his 45th birthday, Billy Wayne Waldrop was executed in the electric chair at Holman Correctional Facility. Reports from the prison noted that Waldrop sang "Amazing Grace" as the straps held him in place, a haunting contrast to the gravity of the moment. The procedure lasted 9 minutes from the time the chair was first activated, and at 12:20 a.m., he was pronounced dead. For his final meal, he requested a modest spread, steak with onions and a baked potato, accompanied by salad and chocolate cake. In a gesture that surprised some, he also handed over his personal belongings to a fellow inmate before his execution. Among the witnesses was Dottie Jackson, daughter of Thurman Donahue, who attended alongside her husband. She later described a mixture of emotions. Her grief deepened hearing Waldrop sing one of her own favorite hymns, yet she also felt a sense of relief. With his death, she said a horrible chapter of her life and her family's had finally come to a close, marking an end to decades of pain and uncertainty stemming from the crimes committed against her father. Case 10 Michael Swango entered the world in Tacoma, Washington, but much of his early life unfolded in Quincy, Illinois. He was the middle child in the family of Muriel and John Virgil Swango. His father, a career Army officer and Vietnam War veteran, battled alcoholism and depression after returning from service, and this ultimately contributed to his parents' divorce. With his father largely absent, Michael became close to his mother, who became the main influence in his upbringing. Even with the turbulence at home, Swango thrived academically, graduating as valedictorian of Quincy Catholic Boys High School in 1972. He also had a passion for music, playing the clarinet in the school band throughout his teenage years. After high school, Michael Swango enlisted in the Marine Corps, completing his recruit training at the Marine Corps Recruit Depot in San Diego. He earned an honorable discharge in 1980, having never seen combat, but the rigorous training instilled in him a strict dedication to physical fitness. Even during his college years at Quincy University, he was constantly active, jogging across campus, performing calisthenics, and using push-ups as a form of self-discipline whenever instructors criticized him. Swango excelled academically, graduating summa cum laude and receiving the American Chemical Society Award for his achievements. Following this success, he pursued a medical degree at the Southern Illinois University School of Medicine, setting the stage for his future career in healthcare. While attending Southern Illinois University School of Medicine, Swango began to exhibit disturbing patterns. Despite his academic brilliance, he often chose to work as an ambulance attendant instead of focusing on his coursework. During this period, he developed a morbid fascination with patients in critical condition. Colleagues and supervisors barely noticed at the time, but a troubling pattern emerged. Multiple patients under his care experienced sudden, severe medical crises, coding in hospital terms, and at least 5 of them ultimately died. Swango's careless attitude toward his medical training finally caught up with him just a month before graduation. It was discovered that he had falsified patient checkups during his OB/GYN rotation, a practice some classmates had suspected as early as his second year. This infraction nearly led to his expulsion, but because one committee member voted in his favor, he was given a second chance. At the time, a unanimous vote was required to dismiss a student. Concerns about Swango's medical competence had been raised by both students and faculty long before, yet the school ultimately allowed him to graduate a full year behind his original class. This was contingent on repeating the OB/GYN rotation and completing additional assignments across other medical specialties. Despite receiving a scathing evaluation in his dean's letter from SIU, Swango secured a surgical internship at Ohio State University Medical Center in 1983, with a planned residency in neurosurgery afterward. While working on Rhodes Hall, several nurses began noticing an unsettling pattern. Seemingly healthy patients were dying under suspicious circumstances, and Swango was almost always the assigned floor intern at the time. One nurse even witnessed him administering a mysterious injection to a patient who subsequently became acutely ill. When the nurses raised their alarms with hospital administrators, their concerns were dismissed and labeled as paranoia. In 1984, a cursory internal investigation cleared Swango, despite the mounting suspicions. His performance, however, was sloppy and unprofessional enough that Ohio State withdrew their offer for a neurosurgery residency once his internship concluded in June. Later accounts revealed that the hospital feared potential legal action from Swango if they terminated him outright, so they opted to quietly end his tenure after the internship, effectively removing him without directly confronting him about the suspicious incidents. In July 1984, Swango returned to his hometown of Quincy and took a position as an emergency medical technician with the Adams County Ambulance Corps, despite having previously been dismissed from a Springfield ambulance service for forcing a heart patient to drive themselves to the hospital. His co-workers quickly noticed his unsettling behavior and strange fascinations, with one colleague remarking that Swango sometimes feels he has an evil purpose in life. It wasn't long before paramedics began falling mysteriously ill after Swango prepared coffee or brought in food, suffering violent sickness with no clear explanation. By October of that year, police had intervened. The Quincy Police Department arrested Swango after discovering arsenic and other poisonous substances in his possession, including a commercially available ant poison that became his primary method of harming his co-workers. On January 20th, 1985, Swango began working at Fisher-Titus Medical Center in Norwalk, Ohio. In just 5 days, he examined 52 patients without any immediate complaints or problems. However, hospital administrators quickly discovered his troubling past, including his prior arrests and poisonings, and revoked his privileges to work. He had only been on the job for 52 hours. The officials admitted they were unaware of his history when they hired him. Later that year, on August 23, 1985, Swango was convicted of aggravated battery for poisoning his co-workers and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. The case sparked significant criticism of Ohio State University's oversight, with law school dean James Meeks issuing a report condemning the hospital for not involving police sooner and highlighting serious flaws in its handling of Swango. Despite this, it took nearly a decade for OSU to acknowledge it should have called in outside investigators. Meanwhile, prosecutors in Franklin County considered charges of murder and attempted murder, but ultimately refrained due to insufficient physical evidence. After his release from prison in 1989, Swango took a position as a counselor at the State Career Development Center in Newport News, Virginia. His tenure there was short-lived, as he was caught spending work hours assembling a scrapbook of disasters, leading to his dismissal. He then found employment as a laboratory technician for ATI Coal, later known as Vanguard Energy under CETA Logistics. During this period, several employees reported persistent and worsening stomach pains, though Swango's role in these illnesses went unnoticed. Around the same time, he met Kristen Lynn Kinney, a nurse at Riverside Hospital, and the two fell in love and planned to marry. By 1991, Swango resigned from his lab position to pursue a career as a physician, legally changing his name to Daniel J. Adams. Using this new identity, he applied for a residency at Ohio Valley Medical Center in Wheeling, West Virginia, and later, in July 1992, began working at Sanford USD Medical Center in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. In both instances, Swango falsified documents to rebuild his reputation, including a fabricated record from the Illinois Department of Corrections that downplayed his past felony conviction for poisoning to a minor misdemeanor with a 6-month sentence, masking the 5-year prison term he had actually served. Because most states refused to grant medical licenses to individuals with violent felony convictions, Swango resorted to forging official documents to cover his past. He created a false restoration of civil rights letter, supposedly from Virginia Governor Gerald L. Beliles, claiming that the governor had restored Swango's right to vote and serve on a jury. The letter alleged that friends and colleagues had vouched for his exemplary behavior and that he had committed no further crimes after his supposed misdemeanor. With these forgeries, Swango secured a respected position at Sanford USD Medical Center, earning a reputation as a competent physician. However, his attempt to join the American Medical Association triggered a stricter background check, which uncovered his poisoning conviction. Around the same time, the Discovery Channel aired an episode of Justice Files featuring Swango, which combined with the AMA's findings and increasing concern from his colleagues, led to his dismissal from Sanford. Afterward, Kristen Lynn Kinney returned to Virginia, reportedly suffering from violent migraines that ceased once she was no longer involved with him. After slipping under the radar of the AMA, Swango secured a spot in the psychiatric residency program at Stony Brook University School of Medicine in New York. His first assignment placed him in the internal medicine department at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northport. Almost immediately, unexplained deaths began occurring among his patients. 4 months into the rotation, Kristen Lynn Kinney, who had stayed with him, died by suicide. An autopsy revealed arsenic in her system. Shocked and outraged, Kinney's mother, Sharon Cooper, realized that someone with Swango's dangerous history had been allowed to practice medicine. She reached out to a friend of Kinney who had been a nurse at Sanford, who then contacted Sanford's dean, Robert Talley. Talley alerted Jordan Cohen, dean at Stony Brook. Under intense questioning from Alan Miller, head of Stony Brook Psychiatry Department, Swango confessed to falsifying his record and hiding his poisoning conviction. He was immediately terminated, and the scandal forced both Cohen and Miller to resign before year's end. Before leaving, Cohen issued a nationwide warning to all 125 medical schools and 1,000 teaching hospitals, effectively blacklisting Swango from medical residencies across the United States. After the Stony Brook scandal, federal authorities became involved because Swango had practiced at a Veterans Affairs facility. For a time, he disappeared from the public eye, resurfacing in mid-1994 in Atlanta, where he worked as a chemist at a computer equipment company's wastewater treatment facility. When the FBI learned of his location, they notified the company, and Swango was promptly fired for falsifying information on his job application. Shortly afterward, the FBI secured a warrant charging him with using fraudulent credentials to gain access to a Veterans Affairs hospital. By then, Swango had fled the country. In November 1994, he arrived in Zimbabwe and, using forged documents, obtained a position at Neen Lutheran Mission Hospital in the country's central region. Almost immediately, patients under his care began dying under mysterious circumstances. Dr. Christopher Zashiri, the hospital's medical director, grew suspicious and suspended him. However, due to inadequate autopsies, no definitive conclusions could be drawn about the cause of these deaths. While suspended in Zimbabwe, Swango hired attorney David Coltit to try to regain access to clinical work. He also petitioned Mpilo Hospital in Bulawayo to allow him to volunteer temporarily, but this was blocked by Abdallah Mesbah, a surgical resident. Mesbah had often observed Swango wandering the wards and ICU without reason and suspected that some of the sudden patient deaths were linked to him, though he had no concrete evidence at the time. During this period, Swango rented a room from a widowed woman in Bulawayo. Soon after, she fell violently ill following a meal she prepared for herself and a friend. A local surgeon, Michael Cotton, suspected arsenic poisoning and advised sending hair samples to a lab in Pretoria, South Africa. The tests confirmed toxic arsenic levels, and the findings were relayed through the Zimbabwe Republic Police Criminal Investigation Department and Interpol to the FBI. Agents then visited Zimbabwe to interview both Cotton and Bulawayo pathologist Stanford Mate. Sensing that authorities were closing in, Swango fled first to Zambia and then to Namibia, where he secured temporary medical work. Meanwhile, Zimbabwean authorities charged him in absentia for the poisonings. By March 1997, he had applied for a position at the Royal Hospital in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, submitting a fabricated resume. While Swango was moving between Africa and the Middle East, Tom Valerie, Chief investigator for the VA's Office of Inspector General brought in forensic psychiatrist Charlene Tomieson to analyze the case. Drawing on her clinical expertise, Tomieson reviewed all available records and evidence, producing a criminal profile of Swango and explaining possible motives behind his actions. Meanwhile, Valerie coordinated with the FBI and contacted Richard Tomieson at the DEA's Manhattan field office to discuss Swango's lies on his government application, where he had gained access to prescribed narcotics. The evidence collected by investigators, including Swango's fraudulent activities, provided sufficient grounds for the Immigration and Naturalization Service to detain him in June 1997 during a layover at Chicago O'Hare International Airport while he was en route to Saudi Arabia. Faced with mounting evidence and the looming possibility of scrutiny over his time in Zimbabwe, Swango pled guilty to defrauding the government in March 1998. In July of that year, he was sentenced to 3.5 years in prison, with the judge specifically forbidding him from preparing or distributing food or handling any drugs. Federal authorities, including the FBI and prosecutors in New York, were convinced that Swango had killed multiple patients, but building a case strong enough to convict him was no easy task. They were racing against the clock. Federal inmates are eligible for early release after serving 85% of their sentences, which left only a few years to gather solid evidence before he could be free. Investigators dug deep, exhuming the bodies of 3 of Swango's former patients and finding toxic chemicals in all of them. They also uncovered that Swango had deliberately paralyzed Baron Harris with a sedative injection, causing the man to lapse into a coma and die on November 9, 1993. Their investigation also revealed Swango had lied about the death of Cynthia and McGee, a patient from his internship at Ohio State. He had claimed she died of natural causes, but he had actually injected potassium to stop her heart. In July 2000, just days before he would have been released from prison for fraud, federal prosecutors filed charges against him. 3 counts of murder, along with assault, mail fraud, false statements, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. At the same time, Zimbabwe charged him with poisoning 7 patients, 5 of whom died. When informed that he would face extradition to Zimbabwe and potentially the death penalty, Swango negotiated a deal with U.S. prosecutors. He would avoid extradition and the death penalty by accepting life in prison without parole. Michael Swango formally faced charges on July 17, 2000, initially pleading not guilty. However, by September 6th, he changed his plea, admitting guilt to 3 counts of murder, as well as wire and mail fraud, before Judge Jacob Mishler. During his sentencing, Swango openly acknowledged his responsibility for 3 murders, deceit regarding a 4th death, and falsifying information about his 1985 conviction. Prosecutors also presented excerpts from Swango's personal notebook, revealing chilling reflections on the pleasure he derived from his actions. Judge Mishler sentenced him to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Swango is now held at ADX Florence, a supermax prison, a placement he requested after being stabbed by another inmate during his earlier incarceration for fraud and fearing further attacks in the general population. According to investigative journalist James B. Stewart, who documented the case in Blind Eye, circumstantial evidence ties Swango to around 35 suspicious deaths dating back to his time at SIU. The FBI estimates his total number of victims could be as high as 60, potentially ranking him among the most prolific serial killers in U.S. history. Michael Swango tended to follow consistent patterns in his killings. For those outside the hospital setting, such as colleagues at the emergency medical service, he relied primarily on poisons, most often arsenic, secretly adding them to food or drinks. When targeting patients, he sometimes used poisons as well, but more frequently he exploited his medical authority, administering overdoses of prescribed medications or issuing unnecessary prescriptions for drugs with lethal potential. Case 11 William Mansfield Jr. came into the world in 1956 in Grand Rapids, Michigan, as the oldest of 5 siblings. His early life was shadowed by his father, William Mansfield Sr., a convicted child molester with stints in both Michigan and Nevada, who reportedly encouraged his sons to fight among themselves. Despite these troubling influences, Mansfield later claimed that his childhood had been relatively normal and that he had generally gotten along with his family. Everything began to shift when he turned 14. He dropped out of school and even falsified his birth certificate in order to enlist in the U.S. Army. During his time in the military, Mansfield developed a severe dependency on alcohol, and it wasn't long before he experimented with various drugs. His addictions became so pronounced that he was admitted for treatment at a Veterans Administration hospital in Tampa, first in 1978 and again in 1980. On the personal front, he married Phyllis Spielmaker in 1975, and the couple had 2 children together. However, the marriage ended in divorce by 1979, with Spielmaker choosing to remain in Grand Rapids with the children. She later described Mansfield as a closeted bisexual who would bring men home from gay bars and engage in sexual activity in front of her. Spielmaker also revealed that he had once discussed a murder with her, painting a picture of a man who could be charming and easygoing in everyday moments, yet frighteningly violent when intoxicated. On the night of December 31st, 1975, 15-year-old Elaine Louise Ziegler vanished from a KOA campground near Brooksville, Ohio. She had been vacationing with her mother, Betty, and stepfather, Blaine Chalker, and was last seen heading toward the camp showers. When Elaine did not return by the following day, her parents reported her missing, prompting local police and volunteers to organize extensive search efforts across the campground and surrounding areas. During the investigation, multiple accounts emerged. Some witnesses claimed they saw a girl resembling Elaine riding a motorbike and stating she was returning to Ohio, fueling the belief that she might have run away. Yet, other reports placed her speaking with a man in his 20s near the shower area and later entering a light blue 1966 Ford Fairlane with Florida plates. Despite staying an extra week to assist with the search, the Chalkers were forced to return home to Parkman without any sign of their daughter, leaving the case unresolved. On January 31st, 1977, Billy Mansfield admitted guilt to sexually assaulting a babysitter in Grand Rapids, resulting in a 6-month prison sentence and 3 years of probation. Soon after his release, he attacked 2 teenagers in a rural part of the city, violating his parole and landing back in prison. While incarcerated, he shared a cell with 27-year-old Albert Lee III, who confessed to murdering 11-year-old Linda Vanderveen. Mansfield used this information to testify against Lee, securing a reduced sentence and earning his release after roughly a year. On June 19, 1980, Mansfield abducted 18-year-old Pamela Sherrill, forcing her into his van and driving her to a rented trailer where he assaulted her, leaving cuts on her lip and bruises on her neck. Sherrill reported the attack to the authorities, but Mansfield evaded capture. He was eventually arrested on November 23rd in Santa Cruz, posted bail, and was released once more. On December 7th, 1980, the body of 29-year-old Renee Sailing was discovered in a drainage ditch along Buena Vista Road in Watsonville, California, by passing motorists. A mother of 3, Renee had last been seen by her husband, Raymond, the day prior. Her clothing had been violently disturbed, with her blouse and pants pulled down to her ankles. The coroner determined that she had died from strangulation. 4 days later, Billy Mansfield and his 23-year-old brother, Gary, were stopped in Winnemucca, Nevada, by a rookie police officer for questioning in connection with Sailing's murder. They initially lied about their names and ages, but their descriptions matched the Mansfield brothers, and both were taken into custody at the Humboldt County Jail. On December 16th, the brothers were formally arraigned in Watsonville on murder charges. Media outlets soon dubbed them the Bag Brothers because they wore paper bags over their heads to prevent potential witnesses from seeing them. The Mansfields pleaded not guilty and were scheduled to stand trial for Sailing's murder on February 4th, 1981, before Justice John Marlowe. In the early hours of March 23rd, 1980, 18-year-old Carolyn Barrett was abducted at gunpoint from the Treasure Island Motel in Daytona Beach shores. Barrett, who was visiting from Zanesville, Ohio, had been there with 7 friends for spring break when a lone assailant stormed the motel room, ordered everyone to disrobe, stole their belongings, and threatened to kill them if they resisted. when the gunman grabbed one of Barrett's friends to ensure compliance. Carol and selflessly volunteered to go in her place. The following day, her body was discovered along a ditch near 95 at Pecan Park Road in Jacksonville, Florida, roughly 90 miles from the abduction site. She had been shot execution style, with no evidence that she had resisted her attacker. On January 25, 2024, the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office confirmed that after years of investigation, Billy Mansfield Jr. was officially identified as the perpetrator of Carol and Barrett's murder. Mansfield, a white male aged 65 at the time of the announcement, would have been 24 when the crime occurred. According to officials, after a series of interviews spanning 2 years, Mansfield admitted that he matched the police sketch created following Barrett's abduction and confessed to both kidnapping her from the Daytona Beach Shores motel and killing her shortly afterward. Authorities also noted that they would not pursue additional prosecution, given that Mansfield was already serving multiple life sentences for other crimes. In mid-March 1981, the Hernando County Sheriff's Office acted on a tip from an informant claiming a body was buried on the Mansfield family property in Spring Hill. Using a search warrant, officers began digging and soon uncovered a shallow grave containing a skull and scattered bones, partially covered with a blanket. The remains were sent to pathologist Dr. William Whitman, who determined that they belonged to a female under the age of 20. Although the warrant specifically referenced Elaine Ziegler, investigators suspected more victims might be hidden on the property, prompting them to continue their search with assistance from Tampa-based officers and metal detecting specialists. When authorities began examining the Mansfield property, the first remains they uncovered were tentatively identified as Elaine Ziegler's, based on distinctive features of the skull and a missing tooth, though some jewelry found nearby could not be recognized by her family. As excavation continued, investigators often encountered animal bones and debris, but on March 24th, they discovered a small sack containing human bones beneath the fireplace, which prompted a more determined effort despite obstacles like water pipes and electrical wiring above the site. Over time, 3 more sets of human remains were recovered. One, labeled Jane Doe, was believed to be under 13 years old. Another, later confirmed through genetic genealogy as Teresa Fillingham, was initially thought to be an older missing woman, Melinda Harder, but DNA testing eventually clarified her identity as a 16-year-old reported missing in May 1980. The final set belonged to 21-year-old Sandra Jean Graham, a Tampa resident and Hillsborough Community College employee who had last been seen leaving a bar with a man described as a biker, her personal items left behind. The 2 unidentified Jane Doe skulls were later sent to Colorado State University for facial reconstruction under the supervision of retired anthropology professor Dr. Michael Charney, but no definitive matches were made. Teresa Fillingham's identity was finally confirmed in July 2022, while the other Jane Doe remains nameless. Mansfield confessed to murdering 18-year-old Carol and Barrett, yet authorities chose not to press charges because he was already serving a life sentence in California along with 4 more life terms in Florida. He was briefly linked to the killings of 19-year-old Cynthia Clements and 19-year-old Elizabeth Margaret Graham, both sexually assaulted in a similar manner, though James Winkles was later convicted of Graham's murder and remains a suspect in Clement's death. After Mansfield's brother Gary was arrested on drug charges in October 2020, additional human remains were discovered at the Mansfield family property in Spring Hill, Florida. After the skeletons were uncovered, authorities moved Mansfield's trial to San Rafael to reduce the impact of local media coverage and ensure a fair hearing. During the proceedings, the prosecution revisited Mansfield's prior run-ins with the law, as well as reported sightings of him on the night Renee Sailing was murdered. Despite the detailed testimony and evidence, the jury was unable to reach a unanimous verdict, resulting in a mistrial. At the request of Assistant State Attorney Chip Harp, the court granted a 6-month delay before the retrial could proceed. On the night of October 27, 1981, Billy Mansfield, with the help of 22-year-old inmate Ben Berrigan, managed to free himself from chains while in the prison recreation yard. The 2 climbed onto a roof and leapt to the ground, making their escape. A woman passing by initially mistook them for joggers in orange tracksuits and ignored them, but later alerted the authorities. Police quickly organized patrols and deployed sniffer dogs to search the surrounding area. Around 11:45 p.m., a local resident spotted two men running near his house, and officers traced footprints leading toward the river. After an 11-hour search, Mansfield, exhausted and disheveled but still in his prison uniform, was found hiding in bushes at Paradise Park and taken into custody without incident. Shortly afterward, Berrigan was located at Lighthouse Point, also spotted by a citizen, and both were returned safely to jail. Case 12 Raul Meza Jr. entered the world on October 14, 1960, in Travis County, Texas, the son of Raul Meza Sr. and Elvia Ortiz. His childhood was far from stable. By the age of 15, he had lived with several stepfathers and had multiple half-siblings, a patchwork family that reflected constant upheaval. Early exposure to drugs marked his youth. He first began using substances at just 8 years old. Trouble followed soon after, with his first brushes with the law coming in 1973 for shoplifting and burglary. And by the next year, he was already accused of arson. Meza's descent into more serious crime became evident at the end of 1975. On New Year's Eve, he carried out a robbery at a convenience store on South Congress Avenue in Austin. During the holdup, he shot the store clerk, Durley Ramirez, who miraculously survived the attack. For this violent crime, Meza was sentenced to 20 years behind bars. However, he did not serve the full term, as he was released early on parole in February 1981, setting the stage for the next chapters of his troubled and criminal life. In the early 80s, a psychologist described Meza as a man who didn't seem to expect much from his own life, someone distant and disconnected, at risk of repeating harmful behaviors or even turning them on himself. Then, in January, 8-year-old Kendra Page went missing while riding her bicycle near her school in Austin. And a few days later, her body was found in a dumpster on the school grounds, brutally attacked and covered in bruises. Just 3 days after her disappearance, Meza walked into the police and confessed to the murder. And to avoid a trial that could have ended in a death sentence, his lawyers arranged a deal with the district attorney, resulting in a 30-year prison sentence. A tragic story that reminds us how fragile life can be and how darkness can hide behind ordinary faces. After serving 11 years in prison, Meza was released on parole in 1993 for good behavior. He even held a news conference telling the public that in his heart, he knew he would never intentionally harm anyone again. Despite his words and claims of being a born-again Christian who had paid his debt to society, angry residents forced him out of several communities. Not long after, in 1994, he was sent back to prison for breaking a midnight curfew, where he stayed until 2002. Years later, in May 2019, 65-year-old Gloria Lofton was found dead in her home by her daughter. Blood was visible in the hallway and on her pillow, and a used condom was discovered in the kitchen. At the time, the autopsy was inconclusive. While there were signs that she may have been strangled, authorities determined her death was an alcohol-related accident, as there was no definitive proof of foul play, and Lofton was known to struggle with alcohol addiction. It wasn't until 2023 that Meza confessed to her murder. The cause of death was officially updated to homicide by strangulation. Interestingly, a sexual assault kit collected during Lofton's autopsy in 2020 had already matched Meza's DNA. But for reasons that remain unexplained, no action was taken on that evidence at the time. In May 2023, after Meza was arrested, Gloria Lofton's daughter remembered a strange note she had found in her mother's home after her death. The note read, "I, Gloria Elizabeth Lofton, give permission to Raul Meza Jr. to request a certificate of authority on my behalf for the purpose of," but it was never completed. Meza later told investigators that he had been promised a portion of an inheritance, 25%, with the rest supposedly going to Lofton's nephew. However, according to her daughter, Gloria did not have a nephew, leaving it unclear whether Meza had fabricated the story or if someone had actually promised him money. Around the same time, another case unfolded. 80-year-old Jesse Fraga, a retired Travis County probation officer, had befriended Meza after his release from prison in 1993. The Fraga family motivated by strong religious faith, welcomed him into their lives, inviting him to Bible studies and helping him find a home and work. In 2021, Meza even moved in with the Fragas, but tragedy struck when Jesse's wife and son both died of COVID-19. By May 12, 2023, Meza agreed to move out, setting the stage for what would become another chilling chapter in his story. On May 20th, Pflugerville police officers discovered the body of Jesse Fraga in the bathroom closet of his home. The call had come from his niece, who hadn't heard from him in over a week, and asked the police to conduct a welfare check. Inside the house, officers found large amounts of dried blood in multiple rooms and a bloody kitchen knife. Surveillance from a Ring doorbell showed Meza getting into Fraga's truck on May 13th. The truck was later found abandoned off I-35 9 days after the video, with boots inside that appeared to be covered in blood. Meanwhile, Meza's own car was still parked at the Fraga residence, containing a hammer, hatchet, duct tape, and gloves, tools that hinted at the violence that had unfolded within those walls. On May 26th, Meza called the Austin police himself, insisting on speaking with a homicide detective. During the call, he confessed to murdering Gloria Lofton, claiming he had been promised money for her death. He also admitted to killing Jesse Fraga, citing a dispute over alleged sexual activity that had supposedly gotten out of hand, and even referenced a double homicide in San Antonio, though he was never convicted for that case. 3 days later, police arrested Meza while he was carrying a bag filled with a handgun, nylon rope, duct tape, zip ties, a flashlight, and a condom. After his arrest, he chillingly told officers he was ready and prepared to kill again. In September 2024, Meza pleaded guilty to the murder of Fraga and to capital murder with intent to commit sexual assault in Lofton's case. He chose not to appeal and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. When asked by the judge if he felt any remorse, Meza replied simply, "I think it's too late. What's the use if a person will not accept it?" Beyond the 3 murders he was convicted of, police suspect Meza may be connected to as many as 10 other homicides, including 2 in 2018 and another at the beginning of 2019. A search warrant also linked him to multiple sexual assaults after his supervised release ended in 2016, painting a picture of a man whose violent actions span decades.